Jonah Kepler's spacecraft lurched violently, the jarring tremors signaling its unfortunate descent into the hostile terrain of Niranth. A planet notorious for its unpredictable weather, perilous landscapes, and deadly wildlife, it was the last place Jonah ever expected to find himself. As a botanist, he was accustomed to studying the balance of ecosystems, not navigating a crash landing in an alien world. But the malfunction had left him stranded without a working communicator or any immediate way to contact Earth. His only option now was survival. The first few hours after the crash were a blur of panic and chaos. Jonah scrambled to assess his situation, surveying the wreckage of his ship. The hull was cracked, and the interior was a mangled mess of twisted metal and spilled equipment. His primary objective was clear: find shelter and ensure his survival. He didn't have much in terms of supplies, but he could make do. His training had prepared him for expeditions in challenging environments, though nothing could have truly prepared him for the scale of danger Niranth presented. Jonah's immediate concern was food. After salvaging what little he could from the wreck, he set off on foot, determined to find anything edible. The planet's flora was dense and alien, with towering, twisted trees and sprawling, thick underbrush. The air was thick with moisture, and the ground beneath his boots seemed to pulse with life. Niranth was teeming with plant and animal life, though Jonah had little idea of what was safe to consume. But his knowledge of Earth's ecosystems gave him a head start. He was able to identify a few fruits, leafy greens, and fungi that could sustain him until he figured out how to navigate the planet's dangers. As Jonah ventured deeper into the wilderness, the hum of the planet's life began to surround him. He could hear the calls of strange creatures in the distance, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional chirp of something small and unseen. Despite the beauty of it all, Jonah could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. A sense of foreboding hung in the air, as if the planet itself was aware of his presence, evaluating his worth as a potential prey item. The thought chilled him, but he pressed on. After a day of searching for resources, Jonah came upon a cave nestled in a rocky outcropping. The entrance was partially obscured by vegetation, but it seemed like a suitable place to rest. As he approached the cave, however, he heard something: soft, desperate whimpers. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the cry of a predator, it sounded more like a child. He carefully crept forward, his instincts telling him to remain cautious. Peering into the darkened interior, he was stunned to see a group of small creatures huddled together. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, their reptilian scales glistening in the dim light, their eyes wide and filled with fear. They were cubs, alien cubs, clearly terrified and vulnerable. Jonah's mind raced. The cubs were not only helpless but clearly in danger. A sense of protectiveness washed over him. He knew he had to help them. But as he knelt to get a closer look, he heard a deep growl from behind him, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Jonah's pulse quickened. Turning around slowly, he saw the source of the growl, a massive Scythar beast, its glowing red eyes locked on him. The creature was a nightmarish apex predator, towering above Jonah with fangs bared and claws that could shred metal. It was fast, deadly, and relentless. Jonah's mind spun. There was no way he could overpower such a creature with his bare hands, but he wasn't without options. He had knowledge of ecosystems, and that knowledge could help him now. Quickly, he scanned his surroundings, assessing the environment. His thoughts raced through various tactics, considering ways to use the terrain to his advantage. He needed a plan, and fast. He spotted a few vines hanging from the trees above. With a quick assessment, he realized that they could be used as makeshift traps. Jonah moved with surprising speed for someone so out of his element, gathering the vines and setting them up in a quick, crude snare. His heart pounded as he worked, knowing that any mistake could lead to his death. As he finished the trap, he heard the Scythar beast's growl grow louder. It was closing in. Jonah took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation. He knew he had one shot at this. He backed away from the cave, using himself as bait. The Scythar beast followed his every movement, its eyes never leaving him. Jonah led the beast toward the trap, his hands trembling slightly as he positioned himself. The tension in the air was palpable as the predator crept closer, its massive form looming over Jonah. At the last possible moment, Jonah dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the snapping jaws of the beast. The creature, fixated on Jonah, charged forward, and straight into the trap. The vines tightened around the beast's legs, ensnaring it. It let out an angry roar, thrashing violently, but the more it struggled, the tighter the vines became. Jonah knew the creature wouldn't be trapped for long, but it bought him enough time. He needed to move quickly. With his heart racing, Jonah sprinted back toward the cave where the cubs were hidden. The Scythar beast's roars echoed behind him, but Jonah didn't dare look back. He reached the cave, grabbing the cubs one by one and dragging them further into the shadows, away from the creature's line of sight. The cubs were frightened, but Jonah's calm demeanor seemed to reassure them. They huddled close to him as he worked to keep them safe. As Jonah made his way deeper into the cave, he realized that the fight wasn't over. The Scythar beast would likely find its way free soon, and he needed to prepare for the next encounter. His mind raced through possible solutions. Then, he noticed something, a natural crevice in the cave's structure that could be used as a defensive position. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Jonah quickly fortified his position using rocks and fallen debris from the cave's walls. The cubs remained still, sensing the urgency of the situation. The sound of the Scythar beast's footsteps grew louder, signaling its approach. Jonah took a deep breath, readying himself for the next battle. The creature's growls sent shivers down his spine, but Jonah focused on the task at hand. He had to survive, not just for himself, but for the cubs. Then, just as the Scythar beast charged into the cave, ready to strike, Jonah triggered a final trap. A large boulder, loosened from the ceiling, fell directly onto the predator, pinning it to the ground. The Scythar beast let out one final, blood-curdling roar before it fell silent, the creature's struggles ceasing. Jonah exhaled in relief, the danger momentarily passed. As he turned to look at the cubs, he couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. Despite the odds stacked against him, he had managed to protect them. But the moment of victory was fleeting, for he knew the Trexy warriors would not see him as a hero. To them, he was still an outsider. As Jonah caught his breath, he prepared himself for the next challenge, one that would test not only his survival skills but his ability to navigate the complex political landscape of the Trexy world. Jonah's heart pounded in his chest as he was escorted through the towering gates of the Trexy capital. Despite his growing reputation as a hero, the Trexy warriors that surrounded him exuded distrust. They were a species built on strength, a people who valued honor and power above all else. Jonah, a lone human, was an anomaly in their world, a weak outsider whose heroics had, for the moment, spared him from certain death, but his status was fragile. The Trexy had little interest in kindness or compassion. To them, survival was the ultimate currency. Commander Zraktal, the leader of the moderate faction within the Trexy, was waiting for him. Jonah had heard of him through the cub stories. Zraktal was a visionary, one who believed in forging alliances and peaceful coexistence with other species, including humans. It was this belief that had driven him to send a small group of his warriors to retrieve the cubs Jonah had saved. But even Zraktal's influence could not easily shift the tides of an entire society. Jonah was led into a grand hall where Zraktal stood, flanked by several of his most trusted warriors. The commander was tall, his reptilian features sharp and dignified. His eyes gleamed with the wisdom of years spent navigating both the battlefield and the complex political webs of his people. Jonah felt small in comparison, but he stood firm. This was a pivotal moment, and his actions would determine the course of events that followed. The Trexy commander regarded Jonah silently for a long moment before speaking. "You saved my cubs. For that you have my gratitude," Zraktal said, his voice deep and measured. "But tell me, human, why should I trust you? You are an outsider, a being from a distant world with no stake in our future." Jonah met the commander's gaze without hesitation. "I did what I had to in order to survive. But it wasn't just about survival. Those cubs needed protection. And it's not just about me. I believe that if we work together, we can all survive." I'm not your enemy, Zraktal. The commander's expression was unreadable. The silence between them was heavy, thick with suspicion. Jonah knew that words alone would not sway Zraktal's heart. Trust had to be earned, and that would take time. But he wasn't given much time to build that trust. The atmosphere around them was charged, and Jonah could sense the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. The Trexi were on the brink of a civil war, and his presence here, his involvement in saving the cubs, was a spark that could either ignite or extinguish the flames of conflict. For now, Zraktal seemed willing to hear Jonah out. He motioned for Jonah to sit, a gesture of at least temporary respect. As they spoke further, Jonah learned more about the Trexi's fractured society. They were a warrior race, proud and relentless, but their internal divisions were growing more pronounced. One faction, led by Zraktal, sought peace and cooperation with other races, hoping to bring stability to the galaxy. The opposing faction, however, was fiercely isolationist, preferring to keep their world to themselves and reject any form of diplomacy with outside species. Zraktal explained that the Trexi's path toward unity was not an easy one. The faction pushing for peace was small, and they were constantly at odds with the war-hungry leaders who held power in other parts of their society. The tension between these factions had been building for years, and now, with the galaxy in turmoil, the stakes had never been higher. Jonah felt the weight of Zraktal's words. The Trexi were a species teetering on the edge of civil war, and his actions had inadvertently placed him in the center of that storm. He was no longer just a survivor. He was now a symbol, whether he liked it or not, of something greater. His survival had been seen as a sign of goodwill from an outsider, and the Trexi were beginning to look at him not only as a hero but as a potential catalyst for change. But Jonah also knew that his newfound role came with its own set of dangers. The factions within the Trexi were not the only players in this galactic drama. The Vetrax conglomerate, a powerful and shadowy force in the galaxy, had been watching the Trexi with growing interest. They had a vested interest in keeping the Trexi divided, as it would allow them to exploit the species' resources for their own gain. The Vetrax were known for their manipulation and their ability to sow discord in the most fragile of systems. And now, they had set their sights on Jonah. In the days that followed, Jonah found himself at the center of a political maelstrom. The Vetrax conglomerate began to spread lies about him, claiming that his actions were part of a grand scheme to destabilize the Trexi from within. They painted him as a manipulator, a puppet master pulling strings to bring about the very civil war he had been trying to prevent. Jonah was forced to watch as the propaganda machine churned out one piece of false information after another, framing him as a dangerous threat to the fragile peace the Trexi were striving for. The Vetrax's campaign against him was relentless. They infiltrated the Trexi capital, planting agents and whispering in the ears of key figures, spreading disinformation and doubt. Jonah was accused of being a foreign agent, someone sent to divide the Trexi and weaken their ability to defend themselves from external threats. His association with Zraktal only made matters worse. The Vetrax painted the commander as a traitor to the Trexi cause, someone who was willing to sell out his people in exchange for false promises of peace. Jonah was caught in the crossfire. He was no longer just a humble botanist. He was now a political pawn in a galactic game he had no interest in playing. As the tension in the Trexi capital grew, Jonah found himself being pulled in multiple directions. Zraktal, desperate to hold on to his vision of peace, relied on Jonah's voice to counter the Vetrax's lies. But the more Jonah tried to speak out, the more entrenched the divisions became. Every word he said, every attempt to defend himself, only seemed to fuel the fire of distrust. Amidst the growing chaos, Jonah formed an unlikely bond with Kreltii, one of the cubs he had saved. The young Trexi saw Jonah as a father figure, a protector in a world that had never been kind to him. Kreltii's trust became a symbol of the potential for cross-species unity, and Jonah's relationship with the cub would become a beacon of hope for those who still believed in the possibility of peace. As the cub grew more attached to him, Jonah found himself questioning his place in the galaxy. He had come to Niranth simply to survive, but now, he was part of something much larger than himself. The situation was growing more precarious by the day. The Trexy warriors began to turn against one another, and Zraktal's position grew more fragile with every passing hour. The Vetrax's influence was spreading, and the chance for peace seemed increasingly unlikely. But Jonah refused to give up. Despite the lies, the mistrust, and the danger that surrounded him, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let the Trexy destroy themselves. He had to keep fighting, even if it meant fighting against both the Vetrax and the Trexy factions that sought to destroy everything he had come to believe in. It was in the face of these impossible odds that Jonah realized he was no longer just a survivor. He was now a symbol of something greater, a symbol of hope in a galaxy torn apart by division, a living testament to the idea that unity could be achieved, no matter how unlikely it seemed. The battle ahead would not be easy, but Jonah was ready to fight for the future he believed in. The peaceful summit, intended to bring together the fractured Trexy factions, was held in the heart of the capital city, a sprawling structure of towering spires and vast courtyards, meant to symbolize unity. The Trexy were a proud and ancient species, but their pride had led them to the brink of self-destruction. The gathering of leaders was fragile at best, and Jonah had found himself thrust into the middle of it all. Though he had played a critical role in saving the cubs, his position was tenuous. His presence at the summit was meant to serve as a token of hope, a gesture of goodwill from an outsider who had proven his worth. But despite his good intentions, Jonah was fully aware that the situation could implode at any moment. As the summit convened, Jonah found himself surrounded by high-ranking Trexy officials, all of whom regarded him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. The room was filled with delegates from both the war-hungry and peace-seeking factions, and Jonah could feel the tension crackling in the air. Zraktal, ever the steady presence, stood at the forefront, attempting to keep the peace and facilitate dialogue between the opposing factions. The stakes were higher than ever. This summit could either prevent a civil war or accelerate the inevitable conflict. The political landscape was shifting, and Jonah's presence in the room was seen as a wild card. Jonah had been briefed on the goals of the summit, and he understood the importance of diplomacy in this volatile situation. He didn't consider himself a diplomat by any means, but he knew how to listen, how to empathize, and how to understand the broader picture. The Trexy's pain, their history of warfare and isolation, was something Jonah could relate to in some ways. He had seen similar patterns in Earth's own history, cycles of conflict and division, often driven by fear and pride. If there was one thing Jonah had learned from his time stranded on Niranth, it was that survival required cooperation, not division. But the Vetrax conglomerate, with its vast network of spies and agents, had other plans. They saw the Trexy civil war as an opportunity to exploit the planet's resources, and they were determined to see it unfold. Jonah's role as a symbol of unity was a thorn in their side, and they were willing to do whatever it took to ensure that the Trexy remained divided. Through covert operations, the Vetrax had already begun to infiltrate the summit, spreading misinformation and stoking distrust. Jonah had been warned that he would be a target, but nothing could prepare him for the scope of the Vetrax's influence. The summit was supposed to be a moment of peace, a gathering of minds to resolve years of conflict. Instead, it quickly descended into chaos. Just as Zraktal was about to address the assembly, the doors burst open, and several armed factions stormed in, their weapons drawn. The Vetrax's influence had already taken root, and they were now attempting to sabotage the entire peace process. The room erupted into shouts and cries, as Trexy warriors from the opposing factions turned on one another. It was clear that the Vetrax had orchestrated this attack, using the division within the Trexy to further their own agenda. Jonah, who had only intended to observe, found himself thrust into the thick of the violence. His first instinct was to protect those around him, and as the room descended into chaos, Jonah's training and quick thinking kicked in. He had no weapons, only his knowledge of the environment and the tactical insight he had gained over the past few days. His mind raced, calculating the best course of action. There were too many attackers, too many factions vying for power, but there were also advantages to the surroundings. He quickly assessed the layout of the room, the high windows, the large central pillars, and the heavy furniture that could be used as cover. The Vetrax had miscalculated. They had underestimated Jonah's ability to think on his feet. Jonah took immediate action. He ordered the Trexy delegates to seek cover, shouting instructions to the warriors to fall back and regroup. Using the nearby pillars, he managed to create a makeshift defensive perimeter, buying time for Zraktal and the others to organize. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to slow the assault. Jonah then led a small group of warriors to secure the central control room, where communications could be restored. If they could regain control of the facility's security systems, they could lock down the building and prevent further bloodshed. But even as they fought to maintain order, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that the Vetrax had planned for more than just this ambush. The summit was a ruse, a distraction, meant to draw attention away from something far more insidious. The Vetrax were moving swiftly, and Jonah knew that they were not just aiming to create chaos. They were trying to ensure that the Trexy would be too fractured to respond effectively. The attack on the summit was just the beginning. In the midst of the chaos, Jonah's mind raced. He knew that the Trexy's technological advantage, though formidable, wasn't enough to win this fight alone. The Vetrax had resources, intelligence, and influence, and Jonah had to use his own unique skills to turn the tide. He quickly realized that the only way to gain an advantage was to leverage the environment. The Trexy's natural surroundings, their knowledge of the land, and Jonah's own understanding of ecosystems could be used to their benefit. Jonah directed the warriors to use the planet's resources, large boulders, sharp plant life, and the terrain's natural traps, to create defensive fortifications. He worked with them to rig barricades using local materials, a strategy that surprised even the most hardened Trexy warriors. Jonah's approach was unconventional, relying not on brute force but on ingenuity. The Vetrax had expected a straightforward battle, but Jonah knew that in this kind of conflict, creativity and adaptability were just as important as firepower. With the defensive positions set, Jonah and Zraktal led a counteroffensive. Using the cover of darkness and the newly constructed fortifications, they launched a surprise attack on the Vetrax forces, catching them off guard. Jonah's tactical insight, rooted in his understanding of ecosystems and survival tactics, proved to be the key to victory. The Vetrax, who had thought themselves invincible, were now scrambling to hold their ground. But the battle was far from over. The Vetrax were relentless, and their forces were not easily dissuaded. Jonah's heart raced as he coordinated with the Trexy warriors, guiding them through the chaos and ensuring they kept their composure. Despite the odds, Jonah refused to give in. He knew that the Trexy's future, and the future of the galaxy, depended on their ability to stand united. If they failed here, the Vetrax would win. The stakes could not have been higher. In the final moments of the battle, as the Trexy rallied behind Jonah's leadership, they managed to overwhelm the Vetrax's forces. It was a hard-fought victory, but it was one that would change the course of history. The peace summit may have been an illusion, but Jonah's actions had proven something far more important. The Trexy could unite, not through brute force, but through strategic thinking and a willingness to work together. Jonah had not only saved the summit but had shown the Trexy a new way forward. As the battle subsided, Jonah stood alongside Zraktal, who now regarded him with a newfound respect. The Trexy were no longer divided by fear or suspicion. They had fought together, and together, they had prevailed. Jonah's role in the conflict had cemented his place in their history, not as a foreigner, but as a hero who had bridged the gap between species and brought about the possibility of lasting peace. But Jonah knew the real work was just beginning. The Vetrax conglomerate would not back down so easily, and the Trexy's internal struggles were far from over. Yet, in that moment, as the dust settled, Jonah felt a sense of hope that had seemed impossible just days before. The fight was far from over, but it was one worth continuing. The tension in the aftermath of the summit was palpable. The dust from the battle had barely settled, and yet the impact of Jonah's actions reverberated across the Trexy capital. What had once been a fractured and hostile city was beginning to transform. The peace summit had not been a false hope, nor had it been the moment of failure it had seemed when the Vetrax conglomerate had struck. Jonah's courage and ingenuity had turned what could have been a catastrophic defeat into a turning point for the Trexy. Their unity, which had seemed so fragile, had been tested and forged in the fires of battle, and now, more than ever, the possibility of peace seemed within reach. Sraktal stood at the front of the capital's central plaza, surrounded by his most trusted advisors and warriors. He was a man of conviction, but even he could not deny the shift that had occurred. The moderate faction, which had long struggled against the hawkish isolationists, had gained a powerful ally in Jonah, and now it seemed the tides of war were beginning to turn in their favor. The Trexy warriors who had once scorned Jonah's presence now regarded him with newfound respect. The human had proven his worth, not through brute force, but through his intellect, courage, and unshakable resolve. He had done the impossible, he had saved the summit, he had quelled the unrest, and he had fought beside the Trexy warriors to secure a victory that had seemed impossible only days earlier. As Jonah stood at Sraktal's side, a sudden realization struck him. Despite the victory, the war was far from over. The Vetrax conglomerate, though momentarily thwarted, would not easily give up their grip on the Trexy's civil war. They would regroup, they would strategize, and they would come back stronger. But Jonah's presence had already begun to shift the balance. The Trexy, once isolated and distrustful of outsiders, were beginning to see the value of cooperation. They had learned to fight for one another, to protect one another, and in doing so, they had found a new strength, one that Jonah had helped them unlock. The next few days were a whirlwind. Jonah was heralded as a hero throughout the Trexy capital, his name whispered with reverence by the Trexy citizens. But Jonah, ever the humble botanist, refused to let the adulation go to his head. His role in the battle had been one of necessity, not desire for glory. The recognition, while flattering, was secondary to the work that still lay ahead. There were still factions to be reconciled, mistrust to be overcome, and the looming threat of the Vetrax to face. Jonah knew that the true test of peace had yet to come. His task was not to bask in the accolades but to help guide the Trexy through the delicate process of healing and rebuilding. In the days following the summit, Jonah spent hours in discussions with Sraktal and the other leaders of the moderate faction. They worked together, meticulously drafting a plan to bring the divided Trexy people to the table. The path to unity was not easy, and Jonah understood that. Peace was not something that could be achieved in a single battle or by one person's actions alone. It required commitment, understanding, and, above all, time. Jonah's bond with the cubs, especially Krelti, had become a symbol of the new direction the Trexy could take. Krelti had grown close to Jonah, seeing him as more than just a protector. The cubs saw Jonah as a father figure, someone who represented hope for a future where the Trexy could coexist with other species, not through domination or isolation, but through mutual respect and understanding. It was a profound connection, one that transcended the boundaries of species and culture. The trust between Jonah and Krelti became emblematic of the potential for cooperation between humanity and the Trexy, a symbol of what was possible when barriers were broken down and new alliances were forged. However, even as the Trexy began to embrace this vision of unity, Jonah knew that the Vetrax conglomerate would not stand idly by. The Vetrax, seeing the growing strength of the Trexy peace faction, would likely attempt to sow more discord. Jonah had no illusions about their tactics. The Vetrax had operated in the shadows for too long, manipulating events to suit their own ends. They were ruthless, and they had far-reaching influence. Jonah and Sraktal both knew that the peace process would face many challenges in the months to come. Despite these challenges, Jonah remained hopeful. He had seen the strength of the Trexy people, and he had witnessed the power of unity firsthand. The fight was far from over, but the Trexy had taken their first steps toward a brighter future. They were no longer a species defined solely by their warrior culture, but one that had learned the power of empathy, cooperation, and sacrifice. Jonah's efforts did not go unnoticed by the larger galactic community. The Galactic Council, a collective of various species united for the purpose of maintaining peace and cooperation across the galaxy, took note of the events on Nyranth. Jonah's role in averting a civil war among the Trexy earned him a commendation from the Council, and they offered him a position of influence, a chance to continue his work in fostering interspecies relations. However, Jonah declined the offer. His role was not to seek power or recognition, but to continue his work as a humble botanist and advocate for peace. He knew that the galaxy needed more than just diplomats and politicians. It needed individuals who understood the importance of grassroots change, people who would work tirelessly to bridge the gaps between cultures and species. As Jonah prepared to leave Nyranth and return to Earth, the Trexi held a grand ceremony in his honor. Sraktal, speaking on behalf of the Trexi people, bestowed upon Jonah the title of Defender of the Innocent. The Trexi saw Jonah not as a hero in the traditional sense but as a beacon of hope, someone who had shown them the power of understanding and unity. The title, though honorary, held immense weight. It symbolized everything Jonah had done for the Trexi and the galaxy. Despite the grand ceremony and accolades, Jonah's thoughts were elsewhere. He had grown close to the Trexi people, and leaving them felt bittersweet. But he knew that his time on Nyranth had served its purpose. The Trexi were no longer at the precipice of war. They had found a path toward peace, one that would take years to fully walk, but one that was now possible because of their willingness to change. Jonah had played his part, but the Trexi had taken the first steps on their own. As Jonah prepared to board the ship that would take him back to Earth, Krelti approached him one final time. The cub, now more confident and strong than when Jonah had first met him, hugged Jonah tightly. It was a gesture that transcended language, a simple act of trust and gratitude. Jonah placed a hand on Krelti's head, knowing that the cub's future was now full of possibility. He had done what he could, and now it was up to the Trexi to continue down the path of peace and unity. As the ship lifted off from Nyranth, Jonah looked out the window, watching the planet shrink into the distance. He knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that the future was brighter than it had been just weeks before. He had witnessed firsthand the power of one person to change the course of history. And as the stars stretched out before him, Jonah felt a deep sense of hope for the galaxy, knowing that the seeds of peace had been planted, and it was now up to others to nurture them into something lasting.